Part 3 of how to build a digital map case, and I am stoked because today we're cutting some wood. If you're just tuning in, I've covered the basics of what a digital map case is, some considerations for building one, and the materials that I'll be using to build this map case in parts 1 and 2. So make sure to go check them out if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the project. While you're at it, there's no use in stopping at part 3, so make sure you click that subscribe button so you get notified as I finish up the remaining parts so you can learn the ins and outs and maybe build one of your own. And I hear it takes roughly 3.3 seconds to press that little thumbs up thing and subscribe, so... Alright, anyway, today we're going to be covering the several tools that you need to complete the project, the optional tools for getting the job done at variable levels of accessibility, what wood I'll be using to mount the TV to the case, and then how I'll be cutting up the wood. But there's one thing that I genuinely want from you more than anything. Now, I know you know the old saying, there's more than one way to enucleate a beholder.
It's a phrase. I don't think so. It is now.
Which means that how I'm building this display case is not the only way of building it. My goal here is to simply help people, and I think that's where this D&D community and overall TTRPG community really shines. So if you're watching this video or any other video in the series and you see me do something that you know there's a different way of doing it, and I'm not even gonna say better or worse, I would love it if you would put that in the comments for others to see, that way they can consider it when they're building their own. Let's help each other out and get these conversations started. Oh, and feel free to tell me the different ways of enucleating a beholder. All right, enough talk, to the workshop right after this epic intro.
Is it real or just a dream? It's time for MooreDnD. A world of danger mystery.
All right, now that we're in the workshop, let's go ahead and start off with a few of the things that we're definitely gonna need at some point during this project, starting with what we've already used, the tape measure. We're gonna need this a few more times as we go through the project to measure out our wood that we're cutting and such, so make sure you get a good tape measure, and again, as I mentioned in the last video, when you pick one, stick with it. Don't switch tape measures. Next, a drill or a driver, which I highly recommend for when you're fastening the mount that's on the back of the TV to the display case itself. I recommend screwing that into the wood rather than fastening it other ways, but I guess you could do it the other ways, but I recommend a drill. Now, to go with that, I recommend these little 1.25" construction screws. They have the bugle head on the top of them. This is what I would use to fasten that mount onto the map case. You're also gonna need the TV bolts for your TV to affix it to that mount, and you wanna make sure that you have the ones that are not only the right size for the hole, but also the right length to go through not only the TV, but the extra 1/2" mount that's gonna be behind it. I haven't gotten them yet, so I'll just put a picture of what they look like up on the screen. You can find the own branded ones that I have here right at Walmart, and it's a whole kit of them. It comes with pretty much every size you can think of, so if you just buy that, then you're guaranteed to have the option you need. And finally, you're gonna need a chisel. I'll explain why later, but again, you can get another cheap one of these from either Amazon or Home Depot, or if you've got an expensive set laying around, you can use that too. This is a 1/2". This is likely the size we're gonna be using. Now let's get to some things that you'll likely prefer to have during the project, starting with our square here. And yes, this is called a square, and that's because you use it to draw 90-degree angles, which is what we're gonna be drawing for all of our cuts that we'll be making. They have other types of squares like this T-square here, but either one of these works. You can find these anywhere. Next, an orbital sander, or even just a simple palm sander. You're gonna want one of these two because as you're sanding your project along the way, or at the very end when you're making finishing touches, it is nice to be able to have the comfortable ones that do a lot of the work for you, but even the little palm sander, it's a lot nicer than just trying to sand it with sandpaper in your hand. So you're gonna want some kind of palm sander, whether it be electrical or manual. Now, I cannot emphasize the importance of wood glue enough, and I prefer the Tight Bond. I use number 3. They have number 1, which is the original. Either one will work for this project, but wood glue in a lot of cases is actually stronger when you glue 2 pieces of wood together than the wood itself. The wood will break before the bond with the glue does. So, highly recommended to put it even where you're gonna be screwing things together. This is just an added layer of strength to keep that connection together. And you can get a bottle of that, by the way, for like $5. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do recommend that you screw in parts of your project, and if you're doing that, you're gonna want some drill bits to create some pilot holes for those screws. And a pilot hole is simply, oh, these are a wreck right now, but a pilot hole is simply just a hole that goes through your parts before the screw to guide the screw in the right direction. Now, if you're using the construction screws that I mentioned earlier from Home Depot that are just your normal gold construction screws with the star head, all you really need is an 1/8" drill bit. And hopefully you keep your set cleaner than I do. Now, as a safety guy by trade, I do have to cover a couple quick safety tips for this project, starting with, of course, your safety glasses. And it's recommended that you get ones that are ANSI rated. You can find these pretty much anywhere. Kind of reminds me of an old saying that there's more than one way to a nuke. Now, if you are using power tools, you're gonna want some kind of ear protection like these ear plugs, not buds, ear plugs, but buds are fine too. And you can get these super cheap pretty much anywhere also, but I do have some other ones like these headphones that are made specifically for this. If you don't wanna go out and buy ear protection specifically, at least I recommend maybe putting in some earbuds that you use for listening to music, or even some headphones that you have, anything to kind of distort the loud noises as much as you can, because something is better than nothing. You'll also want to make sure that you have your favorite shop Crocs on. And another thing I would recommend is a mask, especially for when you're doing things like sanding, which is going to create a lot of dust. I actually used my last mask and I don't have another one with me, so when I do those parts of the project, I am going to be having the garage door open and ventilating out the space so that way we can get all the dust out into the exterior. And finally, I wanted to talk about gloves because this can be a bit counterintuitive to what you might think. I actually would recommend for certain parts of this project, like cutting, or even if you maybe use a drill press, to not use gloves. And I mean gloves like your leather work gloves or even these latex dipped gloves, because what happens is the protection that they offer will get far outweighed by the damage they can cause. When you have something that's rotating at a really high RPM and your hand gets close to that, the glove is not going to really protect you if it were to make contact, and instead what would happen is as that machine rotates, it could grab the glove and pull your hand further into the machine, causing more damage than it would be helping. So of course, use your gloves when you're handling the wood, when you're picking it up or moving things around, but if you're using heavy machinery, like I mentioned, as a saw or a drill press, take the gloves off during that process just so that way you don't make things worse. All right, now let's talk about what I'm gonna be using to mount the TV to the display case. What kind of wood am I gonna be using? And the first one actually isn't really even considered a wood. This right here is something you might see that comes out of IKEA box or something like that, but it's called MDF or fiberboard, and it's just a really, really densely packed group of fibers sealed together with a bunch of glue, and it is super strong. Now the problem with it is not water resistant. If it gets wet, it's gonna swell up, but in our project here, it is likely not gonna be getting wet because even if you spill something, we're gonna have the case lifted off the table a little bit and it's gonna be protected from above it by the TV. So it's not gonna get wet, so you can use something like this fiberboard, which I just had laying around. Now, the two pieces of fiberboard that I have here, unfortunately, are not long enough to span the length of the TV, and I don't have any other scrap half-inch pieces of wood laying around. So, luckily, I believe, with the thickness of the shallow part of the TV, I think I can fit this 3/4 of an inch board underneath of the two backings that we're gonna have there, the two mounts. So this is another scrap piece of plywood that I had laying around, and you can see the different plies in it, maybe, depending on how the camera works here. But this was just another piece of scrap wood I had from a project, and so this is plenty long enough. I'll be able to cut this down to size and use this as a support behind the TV. So two different kinds of material, both gonna serve the same purpose, even though this one's a little bit thicker, hopefully it should fit. And if not, I'll just have to get another sheet of 1/2 inch to cut down to size. Now this is all stuff that you can find at your local hardware store. It's not too expensive, especially if you're buying the smaller sheets for maybe a smaller TV like we're working with, but make sure that you ask around first to see if anybody has scraps, because almost everyone, when they use a sheet of plywood, doesn't use the entire sheet, and if they save it, then you'll be able to steal it from them and use it for your project. Now, the amount of material that you need depends on the TV that you're using, but for instance, the one that we're doing, you just need enough to cover the short length of the TV in a width that will cover all of the holes. Now, you can do that in two, maybe 4 to 6 inch wide strips that will go the length of the TV above the 2 rows of holes, or you can do one wide sheet that covers that whole span. It doesn't really matter. You just need to make sure that there's enough there to put holes in the middle that when the bolts are in, it's not gonna rip the bolts through and it's not gonna break the wood. So that's why I recommend to at least do the 4 to 6 inch strips. Now the other length that you need, of course, is the long length of your TV if you have a shallow end like we do that you need to support. That part might not even be necessary if your TV is one big consistent thickness. All right, let's talk about how to cut the wood. And as I promised, I'm gonna be going over different ways before I actually cut the wood that you can do it for those of you that might have different accessibility to the tools or for the different skill levels that might be watching this video and trying to learn how to do this. So the first and easiest way of doing this is to have someone else do it for you. you. Now, of course, it sounds like I'm talking about a friend or a family, but if you went to the lumber yard to get your wood, you can actually ask them most of the times to cut the wood to the dimensions that you need. It may be a small fee, 10 bucks, 20 bucks, I'm not totally sure, but you can have them cut it down to the size that you need and rip it to the width that you need, and then at that point, you don't have to worry about using any power tools and hurting yourself. But let's say that you are the true DIYer and you say, no, I have to do this by myself, but I don't have all the fancy tools. That's fine, there are other options. One option is to use the classic handsaw with something called a miter box. And the miter box is what you're gonna use to guide that handsaw to get your perfect 90-degree angle, or maybe 45-degree angle if you want something special. But you can use those two in tandem, and they're usually pretty cheap to get the cuts that you need. Now, the next step up from there is the jigsaw. If you don't have a big, powerful table saw like this, but you still wanna use some kind of power tool to do the work for you, this is a really good option. It does require you to have a little more precision because you're gonna be guiding that saw blade through the wood as you cut it. But if you're comfortable with that, then this will do a lot of the work for you and it'll save you some of that arm strength. I do like this, and this would be really good for the cross cuts, and I'm gonna use this wood that I've got next to me to show what I'm talking about. When you cut the wood this way, a jigsaw would be really good for that because you're going a short distance, it's not that far, and even if you zigzag a little bit, it's not gonna be as noticeable. But when you have to rip the board down to size, that'll be really hard to guide it straight enough, long enough to be able to make that look nice when you're done. So I don't recommend really the jigsaw or even the handsaw for that because that would be pretty rough. Highly recommend having someone else do that part for you if you can't, or using the next tool we're gonna talk about, which is our table saw. This Craftsman right here is a workhorse. It was my grandfather's. He passed it down to my dad and my uncle, who have since passed it down to me. And I think many people would agree it's the best option to use for this scenario. You can do the whole rip of the board by using the fence to guide it straight enough the whole way down. It's gonna give you a nice cut. And then you can use something like this push stick here to get a nice cross cut for a good 90-degree angle. Now that push stick is an option, but I'm actually gonna use another tool behind me called the miter saw. And the miter saw allows you to set the degree that you need to cut the end of a board and then cut it at that angle. So for us, it would obviously be a 90-degree angle, and we would cut it straight across. And that's a little easier than having to push a whole board through a saw. Instead, you move the saw down through the board. So that's just a few options, but you're gonna get to see me use the table saw and the miter saw tonight to cut these boards down. And again, if you're watching this and you know of other ways that people could cut this wood to the dimensions that they need, make sure you comment that so that way they can read it and consider all the options that they have before getting started. All right, let's do it. All right, so as I talked about, I'm gonna be using this miter saw to do all the cross cuts. And I'm gonna start with the cross cuts, that way we can shorten the boards that we have to push through the table saw, because it's a lot harder to push a really long board in than a shorter one. Now this is a sliding miter saw, and that means that it can physically slide forward and back. That's more beneficial if you're using really wide pieces of wood. That way if you have something that's like 12 inches wide, you can cut through the whole thing instead of having to do a little cut, flip it, and cut it again. So this is nice, but not necessary. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video, I do have the plans for this up on Patreon right now, and I was able to print out the image that I have on there that has all the boards and the dimensions that I need physically on the paper, so that way I can just read it out instead of measuring everything that I need again. So we're gonna go ahead and start with the short boards that are 21 7/8 inches long. Now, one thing to note before I start is you do want to inspect the wood that you've bought and find your favorite parts, because remember, this is gonna be the outside of your display case, essentially. It's gonna be something on display all the time. So you wanna find the wood that you like and get rid of the stuff that you don't like. And on this board, there are in particular a couple corners that are pretty beat up, especially right here near where I have the saw blade right now, where I'm actually gonna be cutting that off and giving myself a fresh 90-degree angle. So I have checked the miter saw. It is set to 90 degrees this way. We're good there. I have it supported on both ends, ready to cut, and I have the saw plugged in. So the next step, obviously, is to put on our PPE. Now, I don't need to measure anything this time because, again, I'm just giving myself a fresh cut to start with. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut. Okay, so there's what we have left over after the cut. And normally I would have the garage door open and have a mask on when you're doing a cut like this, because you could see the dust flying up, but it's around 1 in the morning right now and I don't want to wake the neighbors up. Now this is scraps for later. All right, now that we've got a fresh end, we're gonna go ahead and grab our tape measure and measure that length of 21 7/8 of an inch. And we're gonna mark it with what's something called a crow's foot, which is literally just a little caret, a little triangle. And the point is supposed to mark exactly where you're supposed to cut. Okay, now we'll remove the tape measure and slide our board all the way down till that mark is just underneath the saw blade, and then we'll get it honed in perfectly. Now here's where you can really make a simple mistake. We just measured from that end of the board all the way to 21 7/8 of an inch, and we pulled it up to the saw blade. If the mark that we made is on the wrong side of the saw blade, we are going to remove the thickness of that saw blade from the part that we just measured, which will make it that much shorter. So you want to make sure that your mark is on the same side that you just measured from, which I'll show you here. Okay, now that you've got everything lined up perfectly, make sure that it's pressed flat against the back so you're making a nice 90-degree cut, and once you've done so, you're good to go.
But boy, was I wrong.
Whoa. All right, I actually made a little bit of a mistake there. I forgot to lock in my saw, and so the saw was moving slightly, which brought it off track, unfortunately, in the direction of the part that we measured, so that made it slightly shorter than it needed to be. So we're gonna go ahead and recut it, because luckily, I bought enough of a length to be able to do that. So I'm gonna lock in my saw with these little T-track clamps, which on my assembly table, I put in some T-tracks, so that way I could do this. I just forgot to do it before I started. Okay, much better that time. So we have 21 7/8 inches that we're gonna have to rip down to the right width, but that is going to be the two ends, the shorter ends of our digital map case. Now we just repeat the process for the longer end. Okay, so the mounting holes on the TV for that back bracket are about 12 inches apart. And this board right here is roughly 16. So rather than me ripping that down to 4 to 6 inch slices for me to cover 2 holes at a time, I'm gonna leave it the 16-inch width, and then I'm just gonna connect that whole sheet on the back. So the only thing I'm gonna have to do with this is turn it sideways on the table saw and cut it to the correct 21 7/8 inch length to match the TV case. Then the big board that's behind me, that's for the long strip for the support, I'm actually gonna wait until I rip that down to the right width before I cut it on the miter saw, so that way I'm not wasting all of the other scrap. And so that means it's time for the table saw. Okay, now we've reached the beast, this table saw, and we're gonna go over a couple quick things about how to use this. Number one, we're gonna be using this fence here, which can slide left and right, and it's gonna be our guide when we move the wood down through the blade. Now you are able to see the numbers here for measuring, but I tend to still use my tape measure that I use to measure the TV and measure the distance from the blade to the saw, just in case. But we're actually going to start with the fiber board, the MDF, that needs to be cut to the same length as our shorter boards. And instead of me using the tape measure, we're gonna take the easy route and actually put that board in between the blade and the fence to get our exact distance. All right, so we've got our short board here, and I'm gonna lay it up against the fence, and I can slowly slide the fence over, but what you might not be able to notice, because I'm not too zoomed in, the blade is not up yet. I tend to keep that down. So we have to raise that up, but we wanna raise it up to a height just above the material that we're cutting. So that way the teeth of the blade just come over the lip, but the gully that's underneath doesn't. All right, now that that's the right height, we're gonna go ahead and slide this up against that blade to get the right distance that we need to cut to match our short sides here. And we wanna make sure we kind of push from both ends, because if you just push from one, you're gonna angle your fence and it's gonna mess up your whole cut. So we wanna kind of even it out to the point where we just feel it. You don't wanna push against that blade, because if you push against the blade, you're also going to create a really tight fit, which will end up with a smaller cut on the next piece rather than the one that you're trying to copy. Also, I should mention that I have this unplugged while I'm doing all this. I know you see my hand getting close to the blade. We wanna make sure we lock out this machine and make sure it's not attached to any electricity while we're doing this, because you don't wanna run any risk of messing up your hands. All right, it feels good, feels nice and tight. We're gonna go ahead and lock it down. Now, we're gonna go ahead and run this board through it. Now, quick thing to note, I know I talked about this push stick and I've talked about a fence. You never wanna use them in tandem. When you use a push stick and a fence, it'll start to follow one or the other a little bit more and might twist the board. And twisting the board in a table saw is one of the scariest things you can do, because that's when you're gonna get kickback. Kickback is what happens when your board twists a little bit, the blade catches the wood, and rather than cutting it, sends it flying backwards towards you. And a lot of people have big leather aprons for just that scenario, because that leather apron can actually stop that force when it hits you. I don't have one of those, but I know at least not to use both of these at the same time, and I wanna pass that on to you. So we are only going to be using the fence. We are not going to be using this push stick at the moment. All right, the machine is plugged in. We've got our board ready to go. It is pressed up nicely against the fence. The fence is locked in. The blade's at the right height. Our feed table is cleared, so that way when we push it through, it's not gonna hit anything, and I don't have anything around me that I could trip on while I'm doing this. So everything here is good to go, but I do wanna show you one more thing. We have these two push blocks that I have. This one a lot simpler than the other one, and I tend to actually use this one more. This is so that you can firmly push down on your board as you push it through, get a little bit more of a grip rather than just your hands, and it's another means of keeping your hands a little bit further away from the blade, because I would much rather the blade run into this than this. So let's go ahead and get started and push this wood through the blade. Alrighty, so I noticed about halfway through that I did not have my ear pro on like I should have, but at that point, that's not something you want to stop and do because you could cause some kind of catastrophic mistake and you don't want to take that risk. So unfortunately, I had to finish without it, but we got the cut done. It's the right length, it came out great, and now we're gonna move on to the other ones where we'll rip the board down to the right width. Okay, so we know that we need to measure this to 4 inches because that's what we're ripping our boards down to, because the height of our map case is 4 inches plus the little feet. So let's go ahead and bring this fence in, and we need to remember that that 4 inches needs to be on the inside of the blade, not the outside. Because if you put it on the outside, once again, you're going to lose the width of that blade in your length there. So it would be more like 3 7/8 inches because a lot of the blades that you use are gonna be an 1/8 inch thick. Now the only wood we're gonna be running through here at this point is 3/4 of an inch thick. We've already cut our 1/2 inch, so we're done with that size. So we gotta go ahead and raise that blade up, once again, bringing the tooth just above the wood, but not the bottom of the gully. So right about there should be fine. All right, the machine is plugged back in. I've got my little push block that I'm gonna be using. We're gonna get the wood in the right spot, start up the machine, and get this thing cut. Okay, I set the 4-inch piece to the side. This is currently laying how it was remaining on the outside of the blade. Now it's up to you. You can run this along the fence, and then when you cut it, you'll have another cut end on this side. Or if you like what's on this side, you can flip it and put that against the fence so you can keep that side and cut off this inside. It's totally up to you, but I'm actually going to keep the cut side that we just had and get rid of the outside edge. Okay, now let's do the longer board. Okay, now one final thing for the back support that we're gonna have on the TV. I just measured, it's about 3 inches wide. We could get away with 4, but I'm gonna go ahead and move this fence in a little bit to make it a 3-inch cut, and then I'll run that long board through it. Whew. Okay, well there you have it. We have our 2 long sides to the map case, our 2 short sides. We have our narrow TV support, and then we have our mount board that's gonna actually hold the TV to the whole display case. All right, now that we've got everything cut, the next part is gonna be all about fastening everything together to make the box. We're not gonna be including the mounts in that video because that's gonna come after we put the TV in to make sure it all fits. So we're really just gonna be putting these 4 pieces of wood together, and we're gonna do that with brad nails, and we're gonna use glue, but I'll show you some other ways that you could possibly do it too. So get on over to the next part, and I'll see you there. And don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe, please.